Alright guys, welcome to the elements of visual design. I just want to take this moment to take you through some of the basic elements of graphic design. This is the theoretical underpinning for all graphic design work. The elements of design along with the principles. But for this presentation, I'll just be taking you through the elements. So, as you see on screen, visual elements are the building blocks of composition in the art and graphic design. They are the building blocks, or if you could say it another way, the foundation of composition. And composition is a key term in graphic design that you will often see, and that just refers to the arrangement of the elements of design according to the principles of design. So if you are using text and imagery, or you're using text alone and you're organizing text in space, that's still a composition. Okay? Excellent. So the first element you want to look at is the point, or more traditional art might just say a mark. So this is the starting point of all design work. So a point marks a position in space. Graphically, a point takes form as a dot or visible mark. So it's what you start with. It's what you start with. Now, the compositional term focal point brings the objective and the subjective together by being the first place the eye is drawn to in a composition, and usually contains the most important piece of visual communication. So what does this mean? What does it mean to bring the objective and the subjective together? The objective is the area of space that you don't get away from. If you're working on 8.5, 11, that's the space you have. What the focal point does in the design is to bring the viewer's eye to a particular position on that 8.5, 11 space that you're working with. So the focal point, as you see there, it draws the viewer's attention to the most important piece of communication. So if, for instance, you're working on a party poster, this is one of the things many people tend to do. The focal point might be the name of the event or the location of the event, depending on how often the event happens or anything like that. Alright, so that's point. So point, so we have two things we want to draw from this first element here. A point just refers to any mark you make to start, to get the design started. A mark in space. And focal point now is that area of a design that you want to draw the eye of the viewer to the most important thing. Alright, let's keep it moving. Line. Okay, so a line now is building on the first mark you made. So a line is an infinite series of points. So you start with a point, one more point, another point, another point, you end up with a line. So graphically, a line is a connection between 2 points, or it is the path of a moving point. So very important. You'll understand why as you progress in the course. A line can be a positive mark, or the space between 2 or more positive shapes. So what does that mean? That means a line can be an actual mark you're looking at, or a line can be implied by virtue. Let's say you had 2 squares positioned parallel to each other on screen. That space between the 2 squares, a line is there as well. So you have to pay attention, and that is what is meant by negative space between positive shapes. So the positive shapes would be those 2 squares, and the negative, the area, the space between them is a negative space that forms a line. Lines also appear at the edges of objects where 2 planes meet. Alright, and you can understand this fairly well. Okay, so lines also exist in many weights. The thickness and texture, as well as the path of the mark, determine its visual presence. Now, this in traditional art is called line quality. Right? The line has a certain weight. Let me put this in practical terms for you. If you use a pencil to make a line, it is different from a line made by a marker, which is still different from a line made by a paintbrush. Or if I just put some paint on my hands and I made a line on a surface, all of those will present same line but with different thickness, weights. The quality of the line is different. And I don't mean quality here in terms of one is better or worse. It is just that this particular line has a certain feature because of the tool used to make the line. So lines can also be straight or curved, continuous or broken. And we know this. And we see lines all around us. So we understand this. Alright. Many lines used together create volumes, planes, and textures. Alright. So we have our point, we have our line. The next thing we're going to move to, again from traditional art, is a plane. A plane is a flat surface extending in height and width. So any extension in terms of height and width, you have a plane. Now a line closes on itself to become a circle or intersects with other lines to create a shape. And we understand that. We have squares, we have triangles, we have rectangles and things like that. Alright, good. Okay, so a plane can be parallel to the picture surface, or it can skew and recede into space. And I imagine all of us have been exposed to this idea of perspective, where things appear a certain way based on distance. So ceilings, walls, floors, and windows are all physical planes. So a plane can be solid, perforated, opaque, or transparent, or it can be textured or smooth. So very important here, I want you to pay attention to two particular planes that will be referenced as shape, that's two-dimensional, or form, three-dimensional planes. So two-dimensional planes are called shapes and three-dimensional shapes are called forms. So very important. So we started with a point, we moved to a line, then we move to a plane, or if you want to, you can say shape right here. Alright, we're now going to progress to another element, the element of color. Now very important, especially when you're dealing with digital art, you want to pay attention to what are called color spaces. So the two primary ones, the two dominant ones, are the RGB color space and the CMYK color space. As you see on screen, RGB means red, green, and blue. And this particular color space is useful for anything screen related. So if you're going to produce any design for the screen, the RGB color mode is advisable. This color mode is called an additive color mode. The color that is produced by anything that emits light. So that can be the sun, computer screen, movie projector, etc. So in the additive color mode, white is the combination of all the colors and black is the absence of color, which makes sense because color is created here via light. Now the subtractive color mode is CMYK, and where additive color can be thought of as the color of projected light, subtractive color is the color of reflected light. Now as light strikes a pigment, and that can be ink, paint, certain wavelengths are absorbed, that is subtracted, while others are reflected back at the viewer, which creates a prism. Now the primary colors of the subtractive color model are cyan, very important, cyan, not cayenne, that's pepper, cyan, magenta, yellow, and some authors might say key, some might just say black. So that's cyan, it's a type of blue, it looks blue, magenta, it looks reddish or pinkish, depends on your view, yellow, and black. So the subtractive color, white is the absence of color, while black is a mixture of all of the colors. So very important, very important. You pay attention to this. Alright, so subtractive color, the CMYK color system is primarily for print. So I told you RGB is for screen, CMYK is primarily for print. Very important though, as you see there on screen, CMY in pigment produces a murky brown rather than a true black. Key color, black pigment, is added in printing to compensate for this. Here are examples of these things. If you notice RGB, where the colors mix, it is white, right there in the center. And for the CMY, where the colors mix, it is black right there. So very important differences in those color modes. Now the question you may ask, you're going to be doing work in Photoshop. Photoshop can produce both of these color modes. Anyone you want to get done, Photoshop produces both. It's up to you, the designer, to determine which color mode you're going to set up. Excellent. Alright, so we have dealt with points, we have dealt with line, plane or shape, and we have dealt with color. Now we want to look at space. Negative space is a space between objects. As we just discussed, you had two rectangles or squares on screen, and the space between them, that's called negative space, because the space where the rectangles or squares occupy is called positive space. Alright, so the space around it and in between is negative space. It's just the way it is described. So for example, the area between a teacup and its handle, that's called negative space. The space between an object and the edges of the composition, it is the space around the object or between lines. Also, those are called negative space. And the opposite of negative space, obviously, is positive space. So to use an example here, if I can maybe draw this area here in the presentation around the text, all of this area where I'm drawing this line is called negative space. Positive space is like where the shape is and where the text is positioned. All of that would be considered positive space. So that's what is meant by negative space and positive space. Alright, so there's no design you're going to do that does not occupy space. A composition only merges in some space. Whether the space is letter size, legal size, tabloid, or 800 by 600 pixels, or some measure like that, your composition must occupy some kind of space. So very important. Alright, so let me keep it moving here. So as you can see, positive space is the area or part of a composition that the subject or object would occupy. So positive space could be a vase of flowers in a still life painting, a person's face in a portrait, or the trees and hills of a landscape painting. All of those are positive space. So we have dealt with points, dealt with line. We're building now. Start with a point. We join 2 points, we get a line. We start to join lines, we get planes or shapes. Then shapes start to have color, and then these shapes, these colored shapes, occupy space. But in addition to color, we also have texture. So texture is a visual and a tactile quality that designers work with. And all of us understand texture, unless you have some weird disease where you cannot feel surfaces when you touch them. You can't feel your own skin or anything like that. All of us would have an awareness of the texture, the kind we can touch, but also the visual texture. For instance, you may look at this presentation and the background. We would not describe this background of this slide presentation as rough. The quality, the tactile, the visual quality of this would be considered smooth. And that's the essence of texture. So texture used both in composition and also printed substrates. So what does that mean? That means that you can maybe print on vinyl, you could print on canvas, you could print on ice gold paper, you could print on linen paper. I'm talking about different paper types that have different textures. Right? So that's where texture is revealed. So that brings us to the end of our presentation on the elements of design. We started with the point, we moved to the line, we moved to the plane or shape, then we went to color, then we went to space, then we ended with texture. Please revisit these things and ensure you get a deeper understanding of all of these things. Thank you very much.